Hi everybody, this is Marianne Mohenraj interviewing for the Speculative Literature Foundation. I'm here with the editors of Snaring New Suns, Speculative Works from Hawaii and Beyond. Tom Gammarino, I should have checked pronunciations beforehand, I'm sorry. Bryan Kamaoli Kuwada, Kealiʻi MacKenzie, and Lyz Soto, and that is not the order that they're sitting in front of us, but they're going to introduce themselves to you, and they will pronounce their names correctly. And we are at the house of Kate Elliott, who is another fabulous genre person who has very kindly let us host the interview here. So, yay! So I'm going to ask the editors to introduce themselves, and then we're just gonna have a conversation. So, Tom, if you could start us off.
Yeah, sure. I'm Tom Gammarino, and I'm a writer of speculative fiction and a teacher of speculative fiction to 11th and 12th graders. And I was so happy to be a part of this project.
Yay!
Hi, I'm Lyz Soto. I am a poet and a speculative writer in poetry, Bryan. Yeah, I mean, I've taught poetry for years, and I'm an advocate for speculative work in general.
Yeah. Awesome.
Well, barbs for going out. My name is Kealiʻi MacKenzie. I'm also a poet, reader of speculative fiction. I do write some speculative poetry that I always say kind of borders more towards the mythic and the legendary. I do my own work, and I believe that poets in general are not paid enough.
I will note, when I started Strange Horizons, way back in...
Strange Horizons does pay well.
Well,
yes!
Well, no, when I had to argue with people. So this is what I'm saying, like when I started the magazine and we were trying to figure out our initial budget and we were going to publish fiction and poetry and art and reviews and articles, quite a few of the people were like, well, we don't have to pay for the poetry. And it's like, we have to pay something. So so I think we started with like $25 a poem. So yeah. So yes, I agree. Poets should be paid. So
thank you.
Aloha nui tākou. My name is Bryan Kamaoli Kuwada. I'm a professor of Hawaiian Studies of actually Mo'olelo Oiwi, which is Hawaiian and Indigenous literature and history. I also believe poets should get paid, although these two poets don't think I believe that.
There's a long backstory.
I write some speculative fiction and some poetry.
You do write poetry.
Surf photographer. Other things, working on a graphic novel now.
nice.
So that's it. Mostly.
I'm so grateful you guys were able to sit down with me for this. So I was just to give the backstory here, this is my third time to Hawaii. I've not been here very long. First time I came as a pure tourist and did all tourist stuff, which was great. And then second time I came for a few days and went to a family wedding and visited Kate, and this visit I was brought up by the University of Hawaii to speak to their students and give a talk. So it just seemed like an amazing opportunity, because the second time I came, back in November, I was in the airport bookstore at Lihue and saw this book sitting there. And could one of you hold it up for the camera? Oh, look, all of you. Nice. Okay, so Snaring New Suns, and it's speculative works from Hawaii and beyond, and it is. And I hadn't heard of it, and I try and keep track of these things a little bit. So I was very excited. I'm not as good at keeping track of it as I would like, in part because we've had sort of an explosion of anthologies from all over the place now. There was a while where there just weren't very many of them, and now there's a lot of great stuff happening. And so I snagged it, and I snagged a copy for my department, and started reading it, and the first thing that really struck me is the cover and the graphic design are beautiful. So the cover, this image, I think in your intro you talk about it being sort of a new representation of Maui. Is that you say, as you see from our cover, even imagining new Maui to trickster their way into changing the world. So I have to admit my only familiarity with Maui is from Moana, which I watched with my children. so I'm coming to this interview from a place of great ignorance. I just want to state that, right? I was super proud that I had an interaction with someone in a store recently, and I, said mahalo as I was finishing the interaction, and she was like, "You did that right," and I was like, "Yes, I did it right." But that is the level of my Hawaiian. So you open this, and sorry, I know I've been talking a lot. I'm going to switch it over to you in just a second, but you open this intro with a quote from Octavia Butler: "There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." And then you go on to talk about sort of what brought you into this. And I don't want to just read people the introduction, so instead I'm going to ask you guys to, you folks, to talk about what brought you to do this anthology and what brought you together. So whoever wants to start things off. Just
Probably makes sense for Bryan and Lyz to field that one first, yeah?
Oh, well, I mean, kind of.
Yeah,
in terms of this anthology itself, but also, there's
It's like
Yeah.
a weird split
Pre-history.
Yeah,
That's
fill us in.
So,
it was in 2016,
good
Right.
about that, dude.
huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was 2016. So Bryan and I were in the same PhD program, and I think one of the things that we bonded over was our interest in speculative work, and then also I think a sorrow that there wasn't greater representation of the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, as ambitious graduate students often do, is really, we can change that. We decided, well, let's try and see whether or not we can put together, some kind of anthology that collects speculative work from around the Pacific and Hawaii. And so Kealiʻi got pulled on board because he is also a lover of speculative work. And then we put out the call.
And the call were terrible.
Oh,
Because in the call we put, we're tired of these representations of the Pacific where everything is exotified, and we don't want to keep reaffirming these colonial tropes and stuff like that. And that was exactly
what we got. Yeah, it was almost like
everyone.
Yeah, it was almost like someone read this and was just like, they're just like, oh no, they're lying. They really want this.
Yeah.
So when you say colonial tropes, do you mean like tourist fantasies, or like what kind of thing were you
Tourist
seeing?
fantasies or like,
Noble savage.
Oh.
I think the worst of like old Star Trek and like stuff from the golden age of
Okay.
science fiction.
Yeah.
You got a lot of military tinge stuff, yeah?
No, actually,
No,
no.
it wasn't too
Probably
much.
not.
Yeah,
But we got stuff where like one guy was writing, I feel like the title, well, I don't want to say the title because it's but I mean, it talked about the strange woman of this island,
Yeah.
and the story was set in Polynesia, which, if we know Polynesia, it's humongous.
Yeah.
So it was just, and then when he wrote to us, he was like, I wanted this story to show how strange the cultures of Polynesia are. And
Yeah.
are they so strange?
Okay, so then that to me is like H. Rider Haggard and Kipling, like the kind of thing they were writing, right?
Yeah,
So like,
yeah.
Haggard has King Solomon's Mines in Africa, and she is, I think, set in India, and there's like, you fight your way through the jungle to the temple that has the monstrous giant woman, etc. Okay, yeah, okay.
I mean, honestly, the best, there were actually a couple good things that we got, but in general, the best response that we got was that it was set in the Pacific. But that was kind of it. It was just like it could have been written anywhere, but it wasn't offensive. So that, that was just like sort of a one-up, where it was just like, oh, good.
Right.
Well, they weren't exotifying anybody or infantilizing anybody.
And I feel like the indigenous submissions we got were like, what is speculative fiction?
Right.
What do you mean by this? And so they would send us stuff and be like, is this it? And we're like, I mean, we're really looking for submissions at this point, so maybe.
Right.
But yeah, so it ended up not
happening.
Yeah, it just sort of petered out.
You have so many pieces now, so there must have been a next step. So then what happened after that?
No, there's something about the difference 5 years makes.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if some of it was the moment we're in now in terms of like so much is out there.
Mm.
There's the marvel of it all, which has kind of put some of the broadest strokes
Oh,
of this
interesting.
kind of thing out into the world, but also the ongoing publication of, you know, a diversity of types of stories and creators, I think help set the stage for,
Right.
you know, getting such a good response that we have.
Well, and also Bamboo Ridge is the oldest literary journal in Hawaii, if I remember correctly. And so, you know, they have a rather large network that we didn't necessarily either. We were like, you know, trying to put it up at different places.
Okay.
Were you paying?
We were trying to. So that was the tricky thing too, is that UH Press was maybe going to publish it, but they were saying that we couldn't pay the writers then. And so I was like, but can we secretly pay them?
we were going
and
back
so
and
we were
forth.
trying to like, you know, well, what if we just don't really, you know, we give them the manuscript, but then we already have taken care of like the payment stuff on the side. So I mean, we were just going to be paying out of our pocket kind of thing.
Oh, okay. Y'all,
so-
next time do a Kickstarter. Okay, this is for anyone listening. If you're trying to fund this kind of thing, the genre has gotten, I think, very used to Kickstarters for this kind of project, and it is, you know, like let everyone chip in $10.
Yeah,
right?
I think we've all contributed to Kickstarters.
Yeah,
for that kind
yeah.
of thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So as time passed, and then you contacted Bamboo Ridge, or no?
No, actually, they contacted
Maybe
you
they
first.
contacted me
I think
first.
they contacted you first.
I think so. So I have a kind of different prehistory here. I had a short story in, what's this, 118? I guess mine was in this is 122. I think in issue 120 I had a speculative short story. It was about a kind of a transhumanist who grew up partly in Hawaii, has left Hawaii and had a very oppressive childhood. He has cochlear implants, as two of my children do. But his father is very belittling, puts him down. So he has this miserable childhood, but he begins to tell himself, I'm actually a little bit closer to the future than you are, Dad. You're kind of a dinosaur. I'm the future because I'm a cyborg. You know, and that's where things are headed. And the only thing he's interested in studying is the future studies. And I guess UH actually has a decent program, well-known program. I don't know much about it. I should. I wrote a story called Future Studies, set here. But anyway, he comes here and he falls in love, and that's a really big problem if you're intent on transcending sort of the human era. Anyway, that story was in an issue a couple before this, and then a former student of mine, Lyz Soto, who's now working in publishing. She works at Soft Skull in New York. She was in my science fiction class. So I started a science fiction class, 11 years ago at Punahou School, a big private school here. And I started it because there was really no place at that school for speculative fiction to get any respect. It was still very much in the SF ghetto at that time. But I noticed whenever I gave students a choice about what to read, invariably they chose something that was fantasy or science fiction. So I made the argument that we need to legitimize this, you know. And that course just blew up. I teach 8 sections a year. Anyway, Alyssa went through that class, and some years later ended up, I think, as an intern at Bamboo Ridge. And I believe this was her brainchild. She said, how about in an editorial meeting, she said, how about a speculative issue? I know somebody who I think should be involved. And sure enough, I got a call and said, absolutely, I'd love to do that. And then I don't quite know how it all got orchestrated, but
Donald Ching was the person that, and you.
Yeah, Donna brought me on, and then
You wrote that. They said you needed poets.
Nice.
So anyway, it worked out, and we did all of our editing high COVID times, all on Zoom. Yeah.
And did they? I'm just curious whether Bamboo Ridge gave you guys budget for your authors, or they a little bit.
We actually had nothing to do with that, really. All the authors got paid.
Oh, that's great.
we got paid
And we
too,
got
which
paid.
was, and I tried to refuse, and they wouldn't let me refuse.
Good. Good
Yeah,
for
so,
them.
yeah,
That's
It
awesome.
was I got into long arguments with Wayne about not paying me and trying to use the money to pay the the contributors were, I guess he still was like, no. This
Yeah,
is
he
budgeted
just
out
like
this
dug
way.
his heels in on that. Anytime you tried to subvert that, no, you will be paid.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I was talking to the students about a couple of days ago was, people were asking, how did I get involved with this or that thing? And what I told them is you just be part of a literary community. You go to readings, you meet people, you volunteer to do stuff at conventions, whatever it is, and spend time with people whose work you find interesting, and then things come out of that, right?
It really is through the university community that we
Yeah.
all know each other.
That's great. That's great, and it's great.
Except for the two of us,
Right.
because we both come out of the slam poetry community, so we originally met that way. Yeah.
Nice. Is there a big slam poetry scene here?
There
Yeah,
was
because of them.
Yeah.
I mean, COVID really. had
Yeah.
a
Oh,
thing.
right.
So I know that it's restarted.
It's
but
restarted.
yeah, we actually there was a good portion of time where Kealoha, who ran First Thursday, that 500 or 600 people would show up.
Wow.
I remember hearing it was the biggest slam in the country.
For a good portion it
Yeah.
was, yeah. And the Grand Slam champion was always just like, I think there would be maybe about 800 to 1,000 people at it.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. I did a little bit of slam poetry in San Francisco, and it was 50 to 75 people, and that felt like a good audience. And,
Nice audience.
yeah, so
Yeah.
they had to pay to get in. It was like $5 or something, and whoever won the slam got the money.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so
that was how it
so it
worked
was,
here, too.
so it was and then I moved to Chicago and went to a slam at the Green Mill, which is the birthplace of slam poetry,
Yeah.
and never did slam poetry again because they were so mean. They're like,
They're
Yeah.
one of the few places that allows negative scores.
they
Yeah.
boo you, they boo and hiss
Yeah.
at you when
Yeah.
you're as you are performing, right? And it's hardcore. So I was like, I attended it, and it's I took students to it, and I was like, okay, I would love to see you guys perform here, but you got to be tough.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we have a sense of like how you came together, how the anthology happened, and you've talked a little bit about what you didn't want that you saw in that first round of subs. So then you put out another call, you got more submissions. Did you actively solicit as well? You did, because it seems like you would need to, right? So can you talk a little about that process and?
I think we basically just kind of put a list together.
Yeah.
We were just
People
like,
you'd love to
okay,
have.
Here are these people that we know are doing work that we admire, and a lot of them were artists. That was
Mhm.
actually
Yeah.
a good portion of them. I mean, then in fact, including the cover art by
Mhm.
Jocelyn Ng. We basically just put a list together and supported that. We were like, yes.
That's great.
I mean, I think what you were saying about community, because I mean, we solicited all the people that we knew that were
Yes,
doing
right.
stuff,
Yeah.
and a lot of them were visual artists, and Jocelyn does poetry and this kind of stuff, this kind of crazy stuff, and we've all worked with her in different.
That's the thing, right? You had sort of deep knowledge of the community, and were
Yeah.
able to draw on that to put this book together. I think it's another as I've watched other people putting together South Asian anthologies or whatever else, you can get a very lopsided kind of result if you don't have deep knowledge of the community, if that makes sense, right? If you just put out a call, there's this question of like, where does it penetrate to? When we started Strange Horizons, we would have, we put a diversity statement in there from the beginning, which was at the time unusual. So like people responded well to that. But as time went on, one of the things that we started talking about was how that wasn't enough. That we were only getting visibility in some communities, and others had no idea we existed, right? And so if we wanted those communities, we needed to do active outreach into them, which meant we needed to know, where they were, right? And if we didn't know, we needed to bring on people who did know, right? So I think that's an ongoing challenge across the board for magazines, anthologies, presses, big publishing houses. I mean, everybody, right? And we're working on it. It's gotten better. Long way to go, but it's gotten better.
It's neat for me though with the this thing. So we did reach out to a bunch of our friends and people we knew, because that was how we were like, please have submissions.
Yeah.
But also we got a bunch of people who were like, oh, I've never seen this person's work before, and they're from Hawaii, and it was very surprising. So it was a big difference from when we tried to do it before. And
Yeah,
so
it was
we're so
really
excited
wonderful.
to see
Yeah.
people doing this kind of stuff, or people that we knew wrote in other genres, but then they were excited by the call and the genre, and then they, put something together for it. So yeah, it was nice.
You want to throw something in?
I have a question. So are you saying that with the first anthology, you mostly got submissions from outside, and but with the second one, people here said, I can do this,
Yeah.
or knew about it. So there's a difference there.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Submissions not about Hawaii, but from Hawaii,
Well,
right?
but also
Yeah.
that people said, oh,
Yeah.
partly because you contacted them, but
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
because people thought to themselves, I could do this.
I mean,
This is
people
something
were
I
excited,
could do.
they
wanted to
and
do
that's
it,
a
yeah.
shift too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
right.
I think part of that too, again, to give credit to Bamboo Ridge, is that they've been cultivating local literature for so long.
Yeah.
that I think there's that sense of people who know Bamboo Ridge are like, oh yeah, let's do that. So I,
Right. Right, because you want to trust that the editor and the publisher, that they're going to be respectful with the work, right? So it's so fraught at the start of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I'd like to sort of slide from there into talking about kind of what were you hoping to get when you put this call out, right? Like, and how did those hopes or those thoughts shape the material you selected? If that makes sense, right?
I remember early discussions about what should be the scope, actually the geographic scope of this thing. Right? We talked about, is it the Pacific? Is it Hawaii? Is it, island communities? And I guess we landed on Hawaii, but what happened? We needed the and beyond still.
I think a lot of it was that we were a little scarred by our first experience. So the beyond, I think, was actually us sort of, hedging our bets.
Right.
In terms of being like, okay, we really, and again, speculative works from Hawaii. This is our hope. Beyond is like, okay, if this doesn't work out.
We have some, we have writers who are based in Aotearoa and Niue, Guam, other places, I think communities like Pacific diaspora as well.
Right.
Yeah,
on the
absolutely.
continent. So
But they all have ties to Hawaii, or not necessarily.
Some of them, but a lot of
So
them
there is some beyond
Yeah.
as well then. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh yeah, there's some that are not very
Yeah.
connected at all. I
Yeah,
think.
absolutely.
I feel like there were like layers of calls in there. Of
Yeah.
like, we had the broad call of like, please give us submissions, like
Yeah.
at all, because
Yeah.
of again being started the last time.
Right.
But also, I felt like my secret call inside there was like, please, Indigenous writers from the Pacific, Hawaii and the Pacific, write stuff because this is the kind of stuff that we love and we've been wanting to see it. And so we were hoping that there would be some kind of like kernel of that coming in, and I feel like that
And the call was very specific about what we didn't want this time.
yeah.
yes.
We were
Really,
specific
the last time.
Yes.
They just-
I would actually say, if anything, we dialed back from our
You're kidding,
specificity.
really?
Yeah,
No.
absolutely.
Last time we had a very long thing about what we did. Although we also put no L's as a joke, and everybody.
People got mad at that. That was what they got mad at, was no elves.
Well, anytime you put, we saw this at Stranger Horizons, if you put no whatever, writers take it as a challenge, right? They're like, I'm gonna write an Adam and Eve story that they have to take, right?
I'm gonna give you the Hawaiian elf story you can't resist.
Exactly.
I mean,
If we had gotten that, I think we would have welcomed it. It really
we
was a
assumed it was
joke.
clear that it was a joke, but
It backfired a little bit.
That's very funny. So you mentioned really hoping to draw some Indigenous writers as part of this. So I am not going to get the terms right. So since I've been visiting here, it seems like there are terms for Indigenous people, for locals, residents, for white people, which may or may not be locals, residents. I got very confused. So I don't know if any of you can like take a stab at like just saying the names and like what they mean, if that makes sense.
I read an essay yesterday by Jeff Chang. Do you guys know Jeff
Yeah.
Chang? Who writes on race? He went to Yolani, he grew up here.
You wrote the book.
Yeah,
hip
we
hop
did.
college, yeah. What's that? Don't stop. Won't do it.
Can't
Yeah.
stop, won't stop.
Can't stop.
Yeah.
But I read a little. He's visiting our school next week, so I was reading a little bit of his work, and he said he grew up here. He's Asian American, but he never thought of himself as Asian American until he left and went to Berkeley for college. Here, he thought there were locals, which I think he says in his mind meant pretty much local Asians, and then there were Native Hawaiians, and then there were Hawai'is.
Which is Haole.
Right.
Haole.
I don't think he made a distinction actually between local Haole and just Haole. I don't seem to remember that. But anyway, yeah, he went to college and learned, I'm this other thing.
And Haole
Maybe,
is white people.
Well, I'll let Bryan speak to that.
Well, I mean,
see-
Haole now, I think mostly people think it means white people, but it just meant foreign before.
Oh, interesting.
And so if you look at even some of our old like traditional mele and stuff like that, they would refer to certain akua or like gods as Haole because they came from Kahiki or a different land.
Yeah.
So like Kamapua Agu is like this well-known Greek god, was called the Akua Haole at one point because he had come here from Kahiki, which is like this mythical land, which also sounds like Tahiti, but there's so. And then I think as time went on, Haole kind of people started to think it just meant white person, and then. But yeah, I mean, and then there's all kinds of there's local Haole people. And, I don't know. In the newspapers, that everybody that wasn't from Hawaii was Haole, correct? Because I mean that was the thing.
So it seems like there are a lot of subtle distinctions, right? And just it's interesting. So when you were doing the call, how did you decide who was welcome to submit? Did you specify? Did you?
No, I don't.
No.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I wanted like indigenous folks to submit, but I mean,
Yeah.
we just wanted good stuff from.
Yeah,
So anyone-
we just wanted something that was really well done.
Right. So if someone, I think, but like, I'm sorry, I'm poking at this a little bit, but I'm just thinking like, well, I'm Asian, but I'm South Asian. I have no presence here, really. I'm totally a foreigner, tourist, etc. kind of person. I would never submit to something like this. It would not be appropriate, right? So, but if you had someone, say, Native Hawaiian who had left, they might submit, right? Or or even
That's
someone
like
who, so for when we were, so I publish, Daisy Lit publishes Jaggery Lit, which is a South Asian lit mag, and we had big conversations about like, who is this magazine open to, right? And so we had like the list of countries that comprise South Asia, which in and of itself, there are different groups define it differently. So Afghanistan is sometimes included and sometimes not, for example, right? So we just say on our call, it's these countries that we're representing. But we also had a conversation about, well, here am I have ethnic ties, historical family kin ties to the area, was born there, but I left when I was 2. I'm very American in a lot of ways, right? And, what if there is a white person who like married a Sri Lankan, moved there, and has lived there for 40 years? They might, have a more, sort of more rich material that's authentic. I hate the word authentic; it makes me crazy. But we wouldn't want to exclude someone like that. And well, we ended up using the phrase like something like, I'd have to go look at the magazine to see what the call says, but it says people from South Asia and its diaspora, or with deep ties to the community, or something like that, is I think what we ended up with, right? So, and then kind of mostly we let people self-identify from there, but.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we were trying to get only people from Hawaii or even only people connected to Hawaii, because we got a lot of submissions from other folks that we really ended up liking, like Rasha Al-Talagi stuff. She's not Hawaiian.
And then she doesn't have any connections to Hawaii.
Yeah,
But she just wrote a great piece
stuff,
about
yeah.
it, set here. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Oh no, it wasn't even set here. There was like a little bit of connection between, I think in her poem about Freddie Gray, there was a little bit of connection between it, but it was more just that it was speculative and kind of fit with the stuff we were calling
And
for.
poetry.
Right.
Yeah.
Poetry. Well, so maybe I
Thinking
can.
like I hate poetry, Liz.
So I might transition to talking about the types of things you include here, unless there's anything else you guys want to say about identity of who you were looking for. No. Okay.
Well, I mean, I think this local is a big identity here, but I think it's very broad. I mean,
Yeah.
and like if you get like 4 local people and we're arguing about what it means to be local, we're all gonna have like
Different ideas.
15 different.
I think that's even some of the reluctance to
No,
try
that's
to be
great.
specific, because I think it's just like a lot of everybody tends to come to it from a slightly different perspective, including it different depending on what neighborhood you come from or what island you grew up on.
Yeah.
It's pretty complicated. I've been here 17 years, and I feel, at least as far as my own internal definitions go, I don't ever get to be local, not having grown up here.
Oh, interesting.
That's the
okay.
thing too. Like some people will come here and they'll be here for a long time, and people are still like, I don't know if I'd call them local. Or somebody will move here like 2 years ago, and then they fit in, and we're like, oh yeah.
Yeah, they're
So
so
pretty
Kate.
Oh, I'm eligible. I'll take it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, so
and,
Kate,
and
Kate,
different people are gonna see different things, right?
Yeah.
Kate and I were talking about this. I have a friend who's thinking of potentially moving here, and you know, we were talking about like how do you, if you go and become engaged in community, right? That seems very different than someone who just buys a house and you know lives in their house and walks on the beach and maybe isn't even here that much, right? Maybe it's a second home or whatever, right?
Absolutely.
Whereas if you are volunteering at the local school or, you know, get involved with the library board or whatever it might be, right? Like there is, sorry, those are the things I do, but the, you know, like the, whatever is the community, you know, that you engage with, and you start getting invited to the kids' birthday parties and all of that kind of thing. I feel like that's a sign of localness.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's a very big and complicated topic, but I really feel that not having been raised here, not having roots here, if I'm going to be here, I really have to make a contribution to this place. Yeah.
So, well, let me ask you then. I'm going to transition into talking about the pieces you chose here, and also like the sort of forms of them. So the book is very diverse in terms of you've got visual art, you've got poetry, you've got short fiction, you've got excerpts from novels. You have some pieces that are so experimental that I literally don't even know what to call them, like Quartet by Jason Edward Lewis. Oh my gosh! I was like, I don't understand this at all. I'm reading the footnotes and I still don't understand it.
And he did reading and didn't even know how to read his own pieces.
Okay.
Because there's one where it's just like symbols, right? And then he's like, with the lights or something.
Yes. So for those of you into experimental lit, check out Quartet by Jason Edward Lewis. So there's a lot of different forms. And then I was thinking about how do you organize an anthology like this, and one thing that struck me is that you didn't seem to be trying to put the most generally accessible stuff at the beginning, right? And that to me seems like a very deliberate choice. I know. So if you could talk about that choice a little bit, how did you determine the order? What were you, and specifically, who were you thinking of as your audience? Because I feel like that determines when you say accessible. It's like accessible to whom, right? So
We hadn't done that.
I
sorry.
don't remember us ever mentioning the word accessible.
Yeah,
No,
that
never came
wasn't
up.
actually really high on our list. I think some of it was that we wanted to open with something that was striking, and
Blaine's piece is definitely
Solomon. And
Blaine.
I mean, and Solomon is also really a well-known artist here, and including the fact that his artistry is very speculative. But then, and then I just loved Blaine's piece. I thought it was just like a beautiful kind of opening.
I felt like we were putting like tent poles of like the pieces that we really felt strongly about, and then we were kind of, because what we did was we had a Google Jamboard where each little sticky was the piece, and so we put the certain pieces, and then we kind of started to move things together that we felt like, I think this would go good after Blaine's piece because it's about this and it has this connection.
Yeah, it was kind of entertaining. It was sort of a speculative work in itself, because at first we just had our own, like we each did our own ideas of organizing it, and then we sort of negotiated put it together, how we were going to put it together.
That was a really fun meeting. It was.
Yeah.
We were thinking largely associatively. You know, this has this element. This has apples in it. So does this one or whatever.
Yeah. I mean,
Some of it was also just by feel. It would just be like, this feels like this would
we
work
feel
really
like
well
their
after
work
this
goes
one.
together with this person.
you can tell there are poets involved with this project. it's very. I mean, I've edited a bunch of fiction anthologies, and this is not how the conversation happens, right? So,
well, I'm a musician too, and I've worked on albums.
Yeah.
And it's very much that same process, right?
yeah.
And we just had a ballad, so now we need, the
Right.
rock with it.
Well, no, and you have that in a fiction anthology. You want variation. You don't want all the all the comedic stuff together, and so you're trying to give the reader an experience, right, as they're moving through it. I think my question was in part because I love that you did it the way you did it. I could imagine another set of editors who were trying to do a very different project where they were like, we want Hawaiian authors to be known in the wider world, and so this is to introduce them to the mainstream, right? And then you might think about accessibility, right? But then you're saying my audience is primarily mainstream readers, right? And so that really changes things. And I'll just give you an example of where this came up for me. Like when I was in grad school, I was writing Bodies in Motion, and my advisor read an early draft, and it's Sri Lankan American stories, and she said, "Oh, you're writing this for white people," and I said, "What?" And she was like, "Well, you explain everything," and I hadn't noticed I was doing it. Like it was not a deliberate thing. I was just so habituated to that, right? And so then I actually kind of went away and thought about it and came back and like, okay, what I want to do is the book should be primarily for people like me and my sisters, like people who, it's a diasporic book, right? So that's like the core. I wanted to be complex and nuanced enough that my sisters wouldn't get bored reading it, right? And then if I can explain a little bit to get the next circle out, right, of like say other Sri Lankans, right, great, without compromising the center circle, right? And then if I can then explain a little more for white people or white Americans or British Americans or whatever it might be, and then again without compromising the inner circles, great, right? So, but I think it's a question of, you don't, I'll just speak for me, I didn't want to prioritize accessibility over the audience that this was most important to. Does that make sense? Right? So, and I feel like you guys you ended up making similar moves, and I'm just going to transition from there to talking about language, if that's right. So, as I said, I have almost no Hawaiian. The first piece in here, after the art piece, the Ghost Catalog of the Plant Library, already has some Hawaiian. There's a line that looks like the line after it is probably the translation of the line. I'm sorry, Brian, I don't know if you can read that. I'm not going to attempt it. Right.
Yeah.
And then the following line is, here are the waters made customary by the people. Yeah. So, and then I think that happens again in that piece for certain lines, but there are also words that are just used without translation in this piece, and in many of the other pieces. And I will tell you, I was reading this, often when I was offline and so on, so I wasn't able to be Google translating the whole time, and I had a certain resistance to I don't want to be stopping every 5 minutes to look up words. That's going to interrupt the reading experience. But I did get to a point, I don't know, halfway through the book where I'm like, okay, I have to go look up mauka, because it got used so often, and I was like, I think I know what it means from context, but I'm not sure. And there is mauka and makai, which I believe is towards the mountain and towards the ocean. So that I've looked up so far, and there's lots I have not yet. And I want to go back and reread now that I know those two words, because I'll get more out of this, because they're used so frequently. But I also wondered, for those words, I wondered I was sure there was a lot of context I was missing, right? So it's one thing to translate mauka, if I'm saying it right, to the mountain. Fine, you can get or inland or whatever as a translation, but it felt like it had so much weight in these pieces that I was kind of missing. So I don't know if you could talk a little just about how you guys were thinking about language and anything really as you were putting this together.
So. Yeah, some of the I don't know if we discussed entirely audience
Mm-hmm.
when it came to these types of things. 'Cause I'm just sort of thinking like there may have been assumptions knowing that Bamboo Ridge is publishing it, and they're very much geared towards a Hawaii audience. So many of the things will be sort of inherent to people who've either grown up here their whole lives, or even if you've been here for a number of years, you start to, come to understand. But so it's interesting to hear the question like that. I'm like, consciously, I don't think any of us were quite thinking about, with maybe the exception of pieces that were entirely in Hawaiian.
Right, the last piece is entirely in Hawaiian, right? I looked at that and I was like, okay, that's going to be some work. So-
We talked about it too much, but at the same time, there have been other publishing projects that I've been a part of where there is a lot of conversation about whether or not to translate words. And I think I've just gotten to the point where I take it for granted that we're not going to translate it. Unless it's integral to the piece, unless it's like the way Blaine did it, she worked it in so that it feels like it's a natural part of the poem.
Right.
That, it's, that's the extra work that somebody has to do if they're going to engage the piece.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting seeing how that conversation has evolved over time, right? When Bodies in Motion came out in 2005 from HarperCollins, and I had to argue with them because they ran the book as the last proofreading reading step. They ran it through Merriam-Webster and italicized all the words that Merriam-Webster didn't know, which was kind of standard practice at the time. But it meant, if you have a paragraph of food description, like I have a bunch of meals and so on, half of the words have made it into Merriam-Webster and half haven't. So the paragraph looks ridiculous, right? It's like, some italicized, some not. And I had to kind of make the argument to them, and I used Carrie Holmes' The Bone People, which is New Zealand, text as my example, and said, look, she doesn't italicize, and she won the Booker Prize. So, so I don't think we have to. And, my sort of mental model is these words are not italicized in my head, right? When my characters, this is just their vocabulary, right? And so yeah. I also don't know that what italicizing gets you really in terms of how does that help anyone, right? So it's sort of a convention of the field for a long time.
Daniel Jose Older has a great TikTok.
Does he?
Spanish words.
Yeah.
And anytime it says Spanish word, the equivalent of italicizing it is him putting on this, he goes out and overemphasizing.
Yes, overemphasizing. Yeah, no, I love that.
But I mean, I think for us too, we're just trusting the authors to do something like italicize or not. We kind of kept it that way.
Right.
Another time people didn't, and there's Hawaiian, Chamorro, some Japanese words too. So
the thing you were saying about sort of concentric circles of audience, that made a lot of sense to me. So I think, see if this makes sense, I'm winging it, but I think probably the smallest circle is those who are going to be able to read the last piece in its entirety, right? 18 pages of straight Hawaiian. But the next circle out is probably I don't know if this makes any sense, but there's, we have Pidgin, we have Hawaiian Creole here, and not too many people who move here later in life are going to get great at that. Some will. But, but everybody knows some, And then there's the language, there's the level where it's just okay, I moved here, and nobody, if you're in, say, Waikiki, everyone's going to say Malka or Makai. They're really just as north and south. No one says that if you've been here any length of time, right?
Sure.
So those words truly don't feel italicized. Those are just words, right? There are other little words, Puka, for instance. This means a whole. But, anybody who's been here any length of time just integrates that into their vocabulary. Right. It's not, there's nothing exotic about it.
Right.
And then I guess the last circle out would be kind of continental U.S. audience, English language, whatever.
Yeah.
I feel like the larger Pacific needs to be in one of those.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been interesting to me seeing the words. So there's a bunch of Tamil in my book. It's all either food terms or endearments. This is what the diasporic child holds on to, right? I've forgotten most of Tamil I apparently spoke when I was 2.5, but those words stay. And it was really interesting. When I first read Preeta Simmerson's Evening is the Whole Day, which is set in Malaysia, but with centers on a Tamil family in Malaysia. I could read her Tamil. She had the same words I had, right? So there's kind of a diasporic experience, right, of like which language words stay with you, which is very different from your project, but it's interesting, right? It's sort of seeing how that plays out. Go ahead.
One of the things too is, I would disagree a little bit with Kealiʻi that none of us thought about the language stuff. Because I think Hawaiian writers, we've been thinking about this language thing for a long time now. And because of the italics is one thing, right? We kind of communally made this decision to stop writing Hawaiian in italics and stuff like that. But I mean, I think some of the refusal to translate in some of this is also about renormalization. And making these things, reintroducing these words that are very key concepts to us as Hawaiians into the kind of normal discourse around things. And so that's why we don't always translate things, and that just the usage of it is, going to be an attempt to make people see that this is, one, a different way of looking at Hawaii, but also that this is something that you should be paying attention to and learning from, and, kind of working into your own. And that's why we do that. Because even like, I also am a translator, I was a translator, and what we would do is we'd oftentimes keep the Hawaiian word there, and maybe run a gloss once or twice, but then just through the repetition and the context, you should start to pick up what it means by the end. And maybe you don't exactly get to translate everything exactly, but then you know what's going on, you have an idea of it. And so, I mean, because that's why if the last story doesn't have any indication what it's about, there's no summary. They asked for a summary, and the author didn't want to give them one.
So it's an interesting question, right? So just to throw some other possible models out there, right? So the online magazines, some of them have been doing bilingual work, and it's easier to do online because you don't have space constraints. So, and you can even make it optional. Someone can click to see the English translation or not, right? And so Strange Horizons actually also does that for content notes now. So like you can click if you want them, and if not, you just enter the story. And it's trickier with print. There's glossaries, so the Bone People has a glossary of all the Maori words. You mostly don't need it because you get it from context, right? Just the way it's played out. If you go and look at it, you'll get more. You'll understand better, right? So because there's quite a lot of Maori in the book, and then I'm thinking also of things like there's this sort of question of like how much we assume people know. So Dorothy Sayers, British mystery writer, and you're like, where is she going with this? But in the last book of this powerful trilogy that is like the culmination of all this stuff, she has a critical scene where the protagonist, she's trying to make a decision. She writes to her uncle for advice, and her uncle writes back this letter, and then that she makes her decision based on this advice. The letter's in French. It's like 3 paragraphs in French. There's no attempt to translate it for you, right? And so, because I think in Sayers' era, it was assumed you'd have enough French to read it, right? Anyone who was literate enough to be reading her stories would have had enough French, right? And so that's just kind of an interesting question of like, what are we assuming? How much of this is class-based? How much do you want to help people or not help people? What are the constraints of print versus digital in terms of space and being able to do that? In Chicago, we have a series called Palabra Pura, which is a bilingual poetry series in Spanish and English. It's awesome, but it takes more work and more, and a certain audience willingness. And I've been to South Asian readings where poetry readings where they would have, poems read in Hindi and Tamil and, and the audience is not going to know all the languages because there's so many South Asian languages, right? And so that's also interesting, right? Like there's this question of, I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry, I've now rambled, but I think it's fascinating. And I wanted to connect it to Kate and I were talking about the fact that there was so much poetry and we started with it, and she showed me some YouTube videos of video of
From
hula.
the Merry Monarch Festival.
Merry Monarch Festival of Hula, and we were talking about chants. And she was talking about how the chant is so integral culturally. And I was fascinated because we have in Sri Lanka, there's the Kandyan dancers, which on the surface look similar in terms of dance and drumming and so on, very ancient traditions. And there are singers and musicians, but the dancers are not constantly chanting as they dance, right? So it feels like a very different thing in the end. So I don't know whether maybe you could speak to, do you feel like this poetic work is in conversation with that kind of tradition of chant and hula? I know almost nothing about this, so this is speaking out of real ignorance now.
That's a good question.
I mean, for me it is. I mean, because Blaine, who wrote that first poem, is familiar with that kind of stuff. And the last piece, the one in Hawaiian, one of the things I love about it is that the author, Hau'oli Alarko, wrote new chants in there. Because chants are parts of, you know, I was even taught that the way that you memorize the story before the introduction of alphabetic literacy, the way that you memorize the story was by memorizing the chants. And then the storytelling was what connected the chants to each part. And so what's neat about Hau'oli's story at the end is that he tells a new story of Pele, who is the volcano Akua, kind of one of the more well-known ones. But he tells a new story of her fighting this older Akua, Aila'au, who was also like the previous volcano deity. But their fight takes place just a few years ago because there's the big eruptions on Hawaii Island, and he wrote all of these new chants to go with it. And so that was what I really loved about that last piece, because it's using all of these traditional story elements to tell a brand new story. And tell it about our akua, because, you know, that's one of the things I think in the Hawaiian community, people are afraid to do that kind of thing because people are so worried about messing it up. So we don't have any new stories of our akua. And I always tell my students, if we don't tell new stories of our akua, does that mean that they died in the 19th century when the last of these stories were recorded, right? So that's really why that last piece, to me, is the last piece, is the exciting piece. I mean, they're all exciting, but you know, for Hawaiian language literature, it's something that isn't normal, I think.
Super interesting.
I will say, like, I know my own work, there is a relationship. It won't be as deep as like Hau'oli, someone who's fluent in the language and is steeped in those traditions. Or even someone who may come from a hula background. But for a lot of us, at least as poets, there are different layers of relation to our own chants and stories. So those get pulled in different ways and shapes.
I mean, I think for me it was very much like depending on which poem we would be talking about, because some of the poems are definitely pulling on what I would say very Western traditions of form, and you know, so it was just like because of my own training, that was what I was really kind of looking at and resonating with. But yeah, there's also definitely that connection to, like interestingly enough, in a print book, right, but orality. And the tradition that poetry has just kind of always been here.
So I'll just put out a request. If any of the poets want to record their pieces, I'd love you guys to have an accompanying website that has those so people can hear them. So that's my pitch to you. Maybe Bamboo Ridge could bring that out or something. So just. So I have one more question. Do you need a break? You're good?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Can I say one more thing quickly?
Of course.
Just because, also if you look at the graphic design of the book, there's all of these constellations.
I love the constellations.
Right.
They're so beautiful.
And they're all navigational things, right? And so that also, I think, is a connection to the chanting and the Oli and these kind of particular star lines that people use for navigation. So yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of thought that went into the structuring of the book and the visual, and because of that.
Yeah, we'll put up on the website when we put this up. We'll put up a photo, but maybe if anyone's just watching the video, could you, Tom? I see you have it open. Can you just maybe hold it up? Maybe you can see a little bit. It's
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Here's one example.
Yeah. So there's different ones, and so there's a variety of constellations. The first one is the Navigator's Triangle, and then the others are just, I guess, local constellations.
And even if you look at, there is one of the visual artists just has I can't remember what page it's on. This one, Kilohoku by Hana Yoshihata. This is all of the stars in the sky. So the artist herself is a sailor on Hokulea, and so all of the stars in the sky are accurate to the actual sky. So
that's
she's very
terrific.
much like, it needs to be like that because
Yeah.
I'm a navigator, you know, I'm a
Oh,
sailor,
yeah,
and I
there's-
can't be just putting random stars up. And so
Yeah.
there is that paying attention to these things and stuff that other people wouldn't necessarily notice, right?
Right.
You know that it's honoring your kind of traditional knowledge by doing it.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I find so exciting about this kind of work, and the way it draws on traditional knowledge, is that it's such a developed conversation artistically, right? Like when I work on, if I'm working on a Sri Lankan cookbook, that food conversation has been happening for 2,000 years, right? And so it is a very, we had lunch just before this, and like the lentils and rice and pol sambal, the coconut sambal, that combo is everywhere on the island, and it is, and it's perfect together. That's really what, like you can tell people tried all kinds of things. Auntie was experimenting, they tried this and they that and whatever, and eventually it evolved to this very sophisticated level of practice. And I feel like this is one thing when I read this kind of work that draws on indigenous traditions, you can feel the depth of it, if that makes sense, right? So anyway, I love that. I love that you guys are doing this. All right, my last question is I'm going to switch to a different kind of politics entirely, about tourism and sort of the fragility of the island ecosystem, because I feel like there are so many pieces in here that address that in one way or another. And it's interesting because Sri Lanka is an island, but we have our own issues with the government's selling off pieces to China, and then they're building things in the harbor and whatever. There's like little parallels, but it's really not the same, I think, is what you're facing here. And the pieces in here reminded me of the arguments that Jamaica Kincaid makes in A Small Place, about how tourism is essential to her island economy, and Antigua is very small, right? So it's like, I think it's geographically the size of Chicago. So, and the only, and I don't know what the current state is, but at the time she was writing those essays, she's sort of saying the only real industry there was tourism. The only college was the college that, of hospitality studies, right? That was sort of your only option. And I feel like there is a interesting and complex, I don't know, I felt like a lot of these pieces were angry, which is totally justified. I wanted to have more conversations with them, because I think if you are in government, there's this dilemma, right, which tourism brings in money, and if you're in a country which has impoverished people, you want that money to like build up better schools and so on. So, but there's a cost to it, right? So if you could talk about anything about that interests you, I would love to hear.
Well, COVID was a very interesting experiment
Yeah.
for this island, right? We saw.
You have a piece about that too. Like there's someone who has a fiction piece about like, well, during COVID, there was a period where we could walk the beaches again, and the native, and then, but now they're coming back, right?
Ecosystems seem to thrive, right? Hanalma Bay did particularly well, I think, during that time. That's the big tourist scuba diving spot. I mean, I hate to call it that, but all natural life seemed to. Well, I guess we're that too. Well, including us, I guess. I mean, I loved driving to work in 20 minutes instead of an hour. That was nice too. Somebody take it. There's a lot to say.
Well, there
is a lot.
Yeah.
There's a limit to how much, like the biological ecosystem can only handle so many people,
sure.
right? Before it starts to break down. And last time we came, you took me we went just to a beach. There was a path that we didn't follow to a sacred spot. I'm sorry, I'm going to forget the specifics of this. And there were signs saying, this is a fragile ecosystem. You have to take a lot of care if you're going to go out there, right?
Yeah.
The birthing stones.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which 20 years ago you could just pull up and
You could drive right up
walk
to it.
in, and now it's, but it's also been restored an incredible amount.
Yeah.
So it was beat down, and then people have been working to.
It's just changed a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking like there are various references in the book to places where the water has been. Sorry, I marked one and now I'm not going to find it quickly. Where like little ponds have basically been made for the tourists. This is one. This is in The Bluest Angel by Don Wallace. So they justified destroying the reef with a dredged artificial beach and call it, quote unquote, for the keiki, the children, the tourist children. Of course, it's all a matter of perspective, right? And I wasn't sure which reef and beach he was talking about, but I definitely had this pang of like, oh, I just went swimming at Magic Island. Is that the one he means?
I was going to say it's probably
That's
not
something
that.
that's
Yeah, and I was like, oh, this is, and I talked to my friend about it. I was like, this is so great. This would be a great place for kids to learn to swim because it's all protected and safe. And now I read this and I was like, oh, I didn't know about destroying the reef. Wait a minute, So now I have very mixed feelings about it.
Well, I mean, the whole Waikiki is all on destroyed
Yeah.
ag land. And, there used to be prime agricultural land where the farmers got kicked off. The land got dredged up. They had to pay the dredging companies to fill back in the land. And then, that's why, and then the Alawai is there. So all the rivers are messed up in that area. The Alawai was supposed to be in and out, and now it's just the one, and it's disgusting.
And Alawai is probably one of the more toxic waterways on the island at this point. And a lot of it is because it's following a path that wasn't and contained in a way it really wasn't supposed to be.
Yeah. But I mean, I think one of the important things about this genre actually, and having Hawaiians and people from Hawaii in it, is that it reminds people that we are future-minded, because I feel like, especially indigenous folks get seen as, living in the past all the time. And so when we protest against this hyper-development that comes out of tourism, or protest against the telescope being put up on top of Mauna Kea because of, I think we think of not just the ecological destruction, but the cultural destruction too, because we Hawaiians feel that the land is our sibling, right? And so there's all kinds of destruction that can take place on that kind of thing. And so we've been absent from visions of the future so long. And so I think that's why this is important, to remind people that when we're talking about protecting the land, we're actually talking about the future. We're talking about these visions of the future. And the visions of the future don't have to be domed cities and everything is shiny and metal, right? It could be green and growing and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's part of why we thought that kind of politics. I mean, and I think people who are angry are writing these kinds of things and trying to imagine different ways of being in the future and all of that kind of stuff. So
I think one of the things that's important to think about with that too is just like the way Hawaii has changed, like the way that we see now is actually it's a very new version of Hawaii. Like it's only really within like the last, I guess, 75 to 100 years that it is changed, and I would say even more so in the last 50 years, particularly the island of Oahu, that has changed so much. And it's been highly influenced by the fact that so much of the approach has been extractive, rather than, okay, well, how can we live with, the land? How can we live with, the non-human creatures? How can we live with each other in a way that's more about building things? And I don't mean skyscrapers, but more in a malama aina kind of tradition, rather than we're just going to take everything that we can, which to some extent the tourist industry kind of can be very extractive.
Well, and tourism presumably, right, is mostly people who are profit seeking, who are behind it, right? So there's, I don't know. I serve in local government in Oak Park, and so I struggle with these issues, right? Because, you know, well, what if it is the government building this out, right? And if it's all nonprofit and if it is being done specifically, you know, with the goal of, you know, improving the lives of locals and getting them better healthcare and food and et cetera, so on, right? There's still, I think, a question of pace. Right? Like, you know, can we do this a little slower? Who are we asking to pay that cost? And, you know, but if we do it a little slower, maybe we won't lose some things that we can never regain, right? So,
Yeah, because pre-pandemic, I think we peaked at, was it like 11 million tourists a year?
Yeah, it was something.
It was 10 or 11, it was double digits. And so it's, you know, it's this ridiculous number that has really skyrocketed from even just 10, 15 years ago. And so it's, you know, and they already had a huge impact before. So, I mean, and what's interesting about Hawaii is it's in people's consciousness in a particular way, so that even when people who are activists or who are, you know, you would think would maybe look past that a little bit, they come here and they still see it as a vacation spot. Like, this is, you know, we're going to go to paradise and we're going to do this and we're going to be in Waikiki and we're going to, you know, be on the beach and, you know, and all of that. And it's a tricky thing. I mean, and that's why so much, I think, of the stuff in here, I didn't think we had that many angry pieces, but I'm also around Hawaiians a lot, so maybe it's relatively.
I'm in favor of the anger, just to be clear.
Yeah,
right? You know,
But I think it's so normalized for us that maybe we didn't necessarily.
But I mean, like, it's, you know, and that's why it's important to get these messages out. Is like, think a little bit, you know, when you come, or don't come. I mean, like, you know.
I think that's you know, like, I've seen people saying, I've seen activists saying, don't come, right? Like, don't come as a tourist, don't come at all. And it's hard from someone from the mainland to assess, like, is that the consensus? Is that, like, what the majority of Hawaiians want? Is that what the majority of Hawaiian activists want? I don't even know, right? And so I think having a larger, louder conversation, like you're doing with this book, is contributing to that, helps bring clarity, right, to everybody. And I think it's really interesting seeing what is contextualized and what isn't. So, you know, I haven't done a ton of stuff here, but I've been to Iolani Palace last time I came, and that was fascinating. And I went online and learned more stuff, and it was really interesting. And I feel like there's, I mean, it's heartbreaking. So I feel like that does a reasonable job. I also went with my sister and her, my niece, on the Dole Plantation tour, and oh my God, you know, it is.
Since I was a child, I don't remember.
There's like a pineapple maze, you know, or something like that. So like it seemed like an appealing. It's like a Disney-ish kind of thing, experience, right? But there's no attempt to provide political context, right? And there are, you know, in the plantation garden, there are plaques and, like, there are big educational pieces that look like they are museum-y things that are going to give you context, but when you go and read them, they're hagiography about Dole and, like, how great he was, right? And I'm like, I felt sick reading it, right? So after having been to Iolani Palace, like, it was just like, I can't believe, and of course I'm guessing it's privately owned and the government can't just go in and make them do better. But, you know, I almost wanted, like, a sign outside Dole Plantation on public land saying, like, just so you know, you know, before you take your kids here, there's some stuff. So, and anyway, I'm sorry, I'm just sort of rambling a little, but I guess all of this goes to the point that you are having a complex conversation, and I do think you're inviting others into it, right?
I have a traditional saying that we have that connects with visiting, but also I think connects with what we're trying to do in the book, and it's ho'okahi lau ka malihini, which means, you know, you get one day as a malihini or a visitor or a stranger, because, you know, Hawaiians can be malihini to other places in Hawaii if they're not from there or they're not familiar with it and stuff like that. And what that means is, you know, you come the first day and we'll eat and we'll hang out and have fun and stuff like that. But then the second day, you should start helping out, start taking, what I mean, like what good house guests do, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, I think that idea of Ho'okahi Lau Kamalihini is good for visiting, because then, hey, pay attention, maybe you should try to get back to this place that you're taking stuff from. But also with the book of like, you're gonna be malihini to a lot of the things in here. You're gonna be unfamiliar with a lot of this stuff. But, and that's fine, but then start trying to go a little bit deeper and start trying to learn a little bit more, and I think that's a good approach for us in general. I think when we go to other indigenous places and just unfamiliar places. But I mean, I think that idea of having to help out after is, I think, an important part of it.
I actually have an essay in another issue of Bamboo Ridge. It's about teaching Aldous Huxley's Brave New World in Hawaii, and some connections that I'd made with my students over the years to tourism. And it's been long enough that I'm not sure I can summarize it well, but it was very much to that effect. There's Hawaii, this real place, and then there's, Hawaii, this kind of virtual reality program that tourists run. And somewhere in there is the problem, right? Yeah, I mean, if you're here for mock luau's and, certain cocktails, that's maybe not enough. I do wonder, I have questions about what ethical tourism could look like.
I mean, I think that would be a great conversation to have. I'd love to see it at a sci-fi convention. I mean, that would be really interesting as we think about the future, right? And what are our next steps? I don't know if you've run across Tobias Bickel wrote a short story, Toy Planes, that was published in Nature. He's a Caribbean author. It's like 2 or 3 pages. It's very short, and it is about the space, his local country's space program, right? Local nation's space program that he is involved with, and is going to go up as an astronaut. I think not Tobias, but the protagonist, and the fact that the locals don't see the point of it, right? And he's having this struggle of, well, we deserve to be in space too. We deserve to be part of that future as well. But it's also costing resources that are not going to other things, right? So it's a very interesting little piece. I think you can find it online, Toy Planes. And I think there is there's just a very interesting conversation happening. And yes, I want to reaffirm, or just highlight something you all said earlier, that, Native Hawaiians are maybe seen, not seen as thinking about the future. I think, Bryan, you were saying that, right? And that, which doesn't mean they aren't, right? So we need to resist that narrative, right?
Bryan actually wrote a really great essay on We Come from the Future. Is that?
No, we live in the future.
We live in the future.
Come join us.
Where is it found?
It was just on our vlog that we wrote, but it went around. But if you,
all right, we can link to it. If it's online, we can link to it.
Look for
Okay.
his name.
Okay.
Yeah, like that.
All right. Awesome. So I'm gonna wrap up because I've kept you guys a long time. I thought we could end with just if there's anything I didn't ask you about, anything you'd like to say about the book. It's fine if there isn't. And then maybe someone could read one of the poems to close us out, if that would be all right. I'm sorry, I didn't warn them about this in advance. They haven't had a chance to think about it. So,
I'm happy to put that on the poets.
So, but as you're thinking about that, Tom, is maybe starting with you and just wrapping around, is there anything else you'd want to add to the conversation we've had so far?
Not really. Just something I've said over and over again is just how honored I feel to have had any part in this.
Thank you.
Oh, I mean, yes, echoing Tom, I am very honored to have had this opportunity to be a part of this, but I think for me it was just like such this hopeful experience, because especially it was healing because of our scarred previous experience, but also even thinking about forward thinking in terms of some of the pieces that are here, just like being super hopeful that there's going to be even more, like through speculation, through speculative works, new ways of looking at the future. You know, that people are going to embrace that, and because you can see that window starting to open with this kind of anthology. So it makes me very hopeful.
I love that.
I don't know if I can add more to what they
Why
already
not?
said. But on top of that, just I was, I think at the time, surprised at how much dealt with relationship to climate, to land, whether it is impending doom from possible climate or catastrophe or envisioning new things. And it's good to see that awareness of land showing up in an environment, continuing to show up in speculative work.
It seemed really present. There were also a lot of bugs, which is awesome.
It's true.
That's true. Yeah.
So, which is great. The story with the blue green yellow. Oh my gosh! I was like, that one's going to stay with me a long time. So, Bryan, is there anything you want to
I
add?
think just, when we keep talking about the audience, I don't know if I have an audience in mind, at least for myself, but it was really something that I wanted to see, like in the order and having the visual art and the poetry, and it was like there's all of these outlets of creative expression for us to envision these futures and and see them and act on them. And so I think creating something like this really just made me happy to see it. And then I was like, and then that's why I'm also surprised when other people read it, because I'm like, oh, wait, this isn't just my book to look at by myself.
And it's in airports.
So,
whoever is sending this to Lihue Airport, thank you.
nice. I would also say, just as a suggestion, I'm guessing what I'm seeing is that there have been far fewer in-person creative gatherings because of COVID, and so we're just starting to get back to it. So I'll just note, even though this book came out last fall, it's not too late to have a book launch event. It's not, you give yourself a whole year of permission, right? And I think it would be, in terms of building community and so on, if you can get some of the authors together to do a reading.
We actually had a bunch.
Okay,
So
good.
We've had a decent amount.
I
didn't go to any of
I
the
think
in-person
they've
ones,
been
though.
public libraries. And
Oh, good.
everything.
Okay.
So, but yeah, we haven't necessarily had a.
We've done some Zoom ones.
We've never all shown up at one.
Yeah, we've all not been together.
Yeah.
So, did I put you on the spot too
I
much
don't
with the
know, there's three
poem,
of us
or are
have
you?
different pages open, so who wants to go? Oh, you're gonna do Niles, right? What are you gonna do? Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm happy if you want to read all three. That's totally
Oh,
Which one
totally
is it?
fine.
Uncle Racist Fist.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, sure.
You read that one.
Okay, so this is Uncle Racist Fist, which is by Jennifer Hasegawa, and I'm going to read it very differently than she does, because I don't know. I mean, because I was at one of the readings that we at, she read it, but I'm going to read it a little bit more pigeony. So, Uncle is Uncle, right? I mean, that's
Okay.
So,
What page is it?
162. Me and Uncle went fishing down South Point side, near the Hot-for-Sea place. They get the long ropes tied to pre-colonial dimensions. Uncle said for no be scared. The bugger tied tight to this plane of existence. Uncle perched our tent inland, and then we went to walk out to the cliffs with our fishing gear. We cast our lines out like missiles into megatons of ocean that get the best kind fish for catch, like ulua, deke, menpachi at nighttime, perch, halaloo. But there's a lot of unknowns that come with the wild innocence. I glanced back at camp, and our tent was doing the hula at sunset. Not awana kind, but kahiko. The wind, Uncle said. Then the cast iron pan we was going to use for fry the fish leapt into the salty air. Then up went the folding chairs. The bag charcoal when bust open and looked like one flock minor birds circling over camp. "Ay sus," Uncle said. "The night marches finally come for me." I heard the ropes groan, tightening in the pull of the full moon tide. "They stay coming. Lie down, put your face down," Uncle said. Lava rock punched me in the hard places and drew blood from the softest. "No, look," Uncle yelled. The clanking faded eventually, and with that, Uncle raised his fist at the dawning place. From the dark chaos of the before times came light, sound, substance that woke even the sleepiest of us. In the still wreckage, my uncle opened his mouth for shout, but instead, out crawled a tiny honu. He launched it straight off his tongue into the yawning surf below. Every atom shimmered, shook by news of this hard-won truce.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
You edited more pigeon in.
I know, I was like, oh shoot, that's not what you wrote. Yeah, sorry, there was some pigeon rolling that just, because I was like, oh shoot, okay, I'm not going to go back.
Well, thank you all so much, and this has been just a fascinating conversation, just really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to more of this kind of conversation going forward. And for anyone watching this, I'll just note that, you know, if we want more of this kind of thing, you've got to support it. Please buy the book, right? Like you need, like presses need to see that people are interested. So buy the book, or get your local library to buy the book, or, you know, teach it in your classroom, etc. So anyway, thank you all.
Thank you.